Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello and welcome to Czechast. I'm Vít Pohanka and normally I don't focus much on day-to-day politics here, but this time I decided to make an exception. The news in Czechia has been dominated by negotiations over forming a new government, and it is now almost certain that former Prime Minister Andrej Babiš is making a political comeback. To help understand how this happened and what kind of government is taking shape, I spoke with my former colleague from the Czech section of the BBC World Service, now commentator and writer for Echo24, Daniel Kaiser, who is also, by the way, the author of a book about former President Václav Havel. So, adjust your volume, sit down, get your coffee or tea if you are back at home, or steady your pace if you're walking or jogging. Here is my conversation with Daniel Kaiser about present-day politics in Czechia.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
Dan, imagine that you are speaking to someone who knows about Czechia, maybe had heard, that there had been there were elections a few weeks ago, but doesn't know much about it. How would you describe the results of the elections? Who were the winners? Who were the losers? What the election showed about Czechia?
I would focus on the losers because that is the more pressing or more important thing. The losers are obviously the current government parties, like 4 parties altogether. The government had a rather bad record on most things, starting with the electricity prices and inflation. Like the inflation altogether, like for the last 4 years, was somewhere between 35 and 40%, which is huge. Also, the real purchase power went down. I think the Czech Republic nowadays is one of the few countries in Europe where the real purchase power is lower than it was, say, in 2020. So, because of this, the governing parties decided to run this campaign or a campaign for this year on, say, bigger, like the biggest questions ever, democracy against dictatorship or democracy against autocracy, West against East. East means Putin, of course. And it was a phony, bogus campaign, and they lost, which, given what I just said, I think they deserved.
Right, but you would admit, that the time when they took over power, or since they took power back in 2021, there was the Russian invasion on Ukraine with all the, effects that it had on the economy, no?
Yes, that's true, but the Czech Republic had, compared to other countries, worse results. So there must be some reason for this. I would say the current government, like the government is now going to get out of power. They reacted to the energy crisis, which of course gripped almost all of Europe, very slowly and in not very intelligent ways. So this was the main factor for the inflation. And this is why I think their record is really, really, really bad. So some people would even say, and these are people who used to vote for example, for the main party of this current government, the ODS. Even some of those people would say that this government was the worst ever since the Czech Republic was founded 33 years ago.
Just for the benefit of the listeners, when you say ODS, you mean Civic Democratic Party of the now outgoing Prime Minister Petr Fiala. So if I understand correctly, you say that the government basically, the result of the election is rather that the government lost rather than the opposition would gain a hard worked for victory. Is that my correct kind of understanding?
That is exactly my point.
Okay, so if you were to describe what the parties that are now negotiating the new government, what they stand for, what their programs or platforms are about.
It is a motley crew, a very diverse bunch of people. So there will be the three parties. The biggest one, which won like 80 mandates from 200 mandates in the parliament, will be the ANO party, which belongs to the former and against future Prime Minister Andrej Babiš. This party calls themselves, catch-all party, so their policies, I would say, depend much on what Babiš thinks when he wakes up every single day. It is, of course, not that extreme. So I would say that this party began 12 years ago as some kind of central liberal, pro-EU, like very conventional party. Then moved to the left, then again to the sovereignist right. So they are now in the European Parliament in the faction together with Marine Le Pen and similar folks. So this party really depends on how Babiš positions himself at the exact moment. Babiš is quite central to the party, so his opinions are the line, but I would also say that in the last 2-3 years, some of the more interesting members or more outstanding, more visible members of the party now are like kind of conservative right-wing people. But on the other hand, Andrej Babiš might decide now not to invite these people into the government. So it really depends. It's really up to him, basically. Then there are two smaller parties. One is SPD. I would say that they are really the populist party of the government. So they are rather left-wing in economy, but at the same time conservative in cultural and, how to put it, civilizational matters. And they are very much anti-EU. Some even playing with the idea of the Czechast, so of getting out of the EU altogether. But they will not have the power to get this through. And then the third party, which is most interesting in my view, is called Motoristé sobě, which means something like motorists or drivers to themselves. By the way, the name, when they were founded, the name was meant halfway as a joke. And this party is economically like Thatcherite. So the classical hard right party. I would say at the same time they are not so populist as the SPD. So they are, for example, not playing with getting out of the EU. But at the same time they are very much against the EU in the sense that they are against the day-to-day interference or constant interference of Brussels into Czech national matters. And this one thing, this willingness stand up to the EU in some pressing issues like some climatic legislation, I think is the main glue for those three parties. So when the government really is formed on these three parties, then the government will be mildly anti-EU, which is quite a change.
Right, and maybe we should mention that what is often said is that behind the motorists, if we call them like that, is kind of the ideological father, rather, of the motorists seems to be Václav Klaus, the ex-president. Would you agree with that?
To a point. So Václav Klaus is in his 80s now. I speak to him occasionally, and so I know that he wasn't that enthusiastic about how the party was developing. He was, of course, a fan at the very beginning, the chairman of the Motoristé sobě parties, until very recently was his person from Václav Klaus. So that's why it's obvious. On the other hand, no one, in the view of Václav Klaus, no one can be better than himself. So he isn't that much excited about the party. So he thinks they are committing unnecessarily some mistakes and doing missteps. So he thinks that they still can improve a lot.
If I understand correctly from what you say, I mean, Andrej Babiš, ideologically speaking, if there, I mean, we will actually get to that right at the end, whether there is any sense of talking about ideologies anymore in politics. But Andrej Babiš seems to have been all over the place, as you indicated, from liberal kind of pro-EU to left-wing to more right-wing nationalist. The SPD or the Direct Democracy Party are kind of difficult to read. I mean, they are probably populist, would be the best shorthand kind of description of them. But motorists, they seem to have some sort of direction. Would you agree with that?
Yes, that's actually what I said. So I think they are really ideologically committed.
Yeah.
They have this old, in my view, good old program of a relatively small state, a sovereign state within the EU, but that doesn't tolerate for Brussels to get into everything you do. And then they are, so their program or their idea was to replace the ODS party, which we already mentioned, which is still the biggest governing party, the biggest of those 5 governing parties now. But the ODS has been gradually shifted to the center, so which means to the left for the last 15, 20 years. And this Motoristé Subě party, they said publicly when they started, when they were founded, or when they were set up, their chairman said publicly, we will replace the ODS. We are the old good ODS from the 90s, which is true to some point. So, and as the name indicates or shows, the party is also very much focused on defending the classical cars against this EU attempt of banning the new cars with the combustion engine. So this one particular very unpopular directive of the EU or issue was chosen by the Motorist Party as a kind pars pro toto matter. So they thought, in my view correctly, that people who still are not aware how much the EU interferes into the matters of day-to-day life or of all-day matters, so that they might wake up to this when they realize that the EU even wants them not to have their beloved old cars and wants to force them into the electric cars. So they identified this one sensible topic, in my view quite rightly. And they also used the fact that it was the current Czech government, when it was presiding over the EU back in 2022, which was quite instrumental in bringing this combustion engine ban into practice. So this new party can say, you guys from the ODS, you actually betrayed our people, so you are against the freedom, although you talk all the time against freedom, against you talk all the time on this alleged fight between democracy and between freedom and bans and authoritative regime. But you are the ones who actually let these bans happen. So we are here to replace you, which is probably an ambition too far, I would say.
Before we get to Andrej Babiš, who still is the kind of dominant figure right now, let me just ask you very briefly once more about the motorists. led officially by Petr Macinka, that you mentioned, the former spokesman for ex-President Václav Klaus, but the kind of unmissable public face of the party is definitely Filip Turek, this kind of entrepreneur who up till now has been member of the European Parliament. And he was, shortly after the elections, he was mentioned as a possible candidate for foreign minister, just to explain to the listeners. But soon after the election, Deník N Daily, one of Czech media, revealed that in the past, Filip Turek had published openly racist and pro-Nazi comments on social media. Those alleged posts were deleted years ago, but the police are now investigating the case. Well, first of all, it would be impossible to imagine that this is just an accident, that right after the elections, this turns up. Maybe the question should be, why didn't it turn up just before the elections to kind of make it more difficult for the motorist party? Is that something that, could have been expected, you think? And more broadly, what do you make of this whole situation about Filip Turek and what it means for the motorists party?
So we have to say or mention that Filip Turek denies some of the more outrageous posts which he should have allegedly made. I think it's still an open question whether he wrote them or not. If not, the situation, the whole affair would be even more interesting, because then the question would be who has done it. Some people, even in the intelligence community, guess that this revelation or this falsification, wherever it was, might have come from the counterintelligence service, which in my view is quite a rich idea. It would really blow up Czech politics when this would be established to be true. But if we assume that these posts were true, I think it means then that Filip Turek, this iconic figure of the motorist party, because he's a 40-year-old young man who was quite a big appeal for other young men, generally speaking, and is a vote winner for the party. So if this is true, it finishes him as a potential member of the future government. I think this is without question. And then the second, the question we actually asked is, why was it published right after the more broad or general agreement between Andrej Babiš and those two smaller parties, who gets what ministry? It was last Friday in the evening, actually, when this agreement was reached, and it was clear that this guy, Filip Turek, should go to the foreign minister, so he would be in charge of the foreign policy of the Czech government. And I just think that some, until now, influential people in our foreign policy couldn't bear the idea that this guy, Filip Turek, would be in the foreign ministry. He has one man behind him, an older, more experienced politician, Jan Zahradil, who was also a member of the European Parliament for many, many years, and who was also quite an outstanding figure in the ODS party up until 2 years ago or 1 year ago. And he has some influence on Filip Turek, and Jan Zahradil is this sort of guy who in the US or in the UK you would call a national conservative, in contrast with neocons. And I just think that some people in the foreign policy establishment in Prague who are actually neocons, basically, were not happy with the idea that there should be influence, that the new foreign minister would be influenced by this one guy who actually doesn't like neocons at all. So this is my, at least, part of explanation behind this whole move. And then the second part of the explanation is that this motorist party as a whole is not liked by what I would call with some exaggeration the Czech deep state. All the three names who come into question as the future ministers coming from this motorist party, are actually being under attack now. So this chairman, Petr Matsinka, should go to the Ministry of Environment. There are demonstrations and open letters signed by hundreds of so-called scientists protesting to the president of the Czech Republic. You shouldn't name this guy because he denies climate warming, etc. He's not a he's anti-scientific or anti-scientific. The third name, which is one guy who should become the Minister of Culture, is also under fire. So I actually think starting with Filip Turek was just a starting point, but the main thing is that this motorist party is the main enemy of the Czech establishment. For some reason, even like bigger enemy than this SPD party, which you would expect, or I would expect, would be probably the number one on the shit list of this establishment or of the deep state. But for some reason, it's not them, it's motoristé sobě.
You are listening to Czechast. I'm Vít Pohanka, and my guest today is Daniel Kaiser, commentator for the Echo24 news site, a veteran journalist and a keen observer of the Czech political scene.
If we can turn to Andrej Babiš, and let me just mention for the benefit of the listeners, and you can add something if I leave something important out. He's now probably heading to become again Czech Prime Minister for the second time. And again, for the listeners, he was born into a prominent Slovak communist family. He grew up partially abroad, thanks to the fact that his father was a prominent communist, as I mentioned, and worked on various missions abroad in the West. Then he studied, Andrej Babiš studied in Bratislava. He now has dual Czech and Slovak citizenship. And even though his Czech language improved, I think, quite significantly, he spoke with a heavy kind of Slovak accent when he entered politics some, let's say, I think 12, 13 years ago. He was also a member of the Communist Party before 1989. And according to the several verdicts of courts, he's a confirmed collaborator with the Communist Secret Police, or STB, even though he's always denied this. None of this seems to matter to a large part of the Czech population. Is that something that surprises you?
So as you already said, Babiš is Slovak by origin, which isn't good or bad. But one interesting thing here is that, as you also said, that Babiš actually wouldn't care to learn Czech language properly until his, 60s. So only when he decided to enter into politics, which is 12 years ago, he started to learn systematically Czech, which shows to me that he wasn't actually interested very much in the country. So he was in Prague, just to make money. He married here, of course, his second marriage, has two younger children in Prague who grew up here. But Babiš himself is now pretending to be kind of a Czech patriot, which in my view is more play than anything else. So the guy is an old oligarch. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when he entered into politics, he was, I think, the second or the third richest man in the country. And back then his step into politics was interpreted as defending his own business interests, which might have been true to some point. But I would say that in the meantime, Babiš has kind of developed passion for politics. So I illustrated his relation with the EU. He started as he started as centrist in the European Parliament. So he was in the same faction where the people from Emmanuel Macron in France were. Since then, he has shifted to the right. So now he's in the same faction with Marine Le Pen, so to speak. But it reflects his own reflections, his own experiences sitting at all those European councils. From what I know, Babiš doesn't hesitate to speak up or speak against at the EU Council when he doesn't like something. Because he thinks of himself like, I'm the guy who really achieved something in his life. So I'm the guy who knows one or thing, how the things should be run. And the majority of the other guys, probably even at the European Council, and certainly in the Czech politics, are like people who don't know a thing, who wouldn't be able to survive in a normal life. So this is, I think, his most motivation today in the politics, to show them, like to show his political rivals that he's more skilled than them. You also mentioned his communist past and the question of whether he was a secret collaborator, or agent of the secret police. I think this question is clear. He was, although we have to say that he didn't work for a part of the Czechoslovak Secret Service, which was directed against the opposition in the country. So he was a businessman who was sent abroad. So he was basically expected to spy on other businessmen, on maybe other countries. Like he was based in Morocco for most of the 80s. And so this is one thing which makes this whole issue of his agent or of his collaboration with the Secret Service less explosive, that it wasn't directed against the dissidents at home. And the second thing is that we are now like 35 years away from when the communists ended. So it is not so urgent anymore. And in between, we have had a president of the republic who was actually also a member of the Communist Party in the 80s and who was much more involved with the secret services than Babiš, because Babiš was just a simple agent, so to speak. And Petr Pavel, who is president now, was an employee of the military secret service who was even trained to be sent to some diplomatic mission somewhere in capitalist or in Western countries, where he would live probably under a covered identity and spy on people. And interesting thing is that when we had the presidential election, which was almost 2 years ago, and some people would mention this, that this guy, Petr Pavel, was heavily involved with the secret services in the 80s. People who would, up until then, attack Babiš on being former communist, being former agent of the secret service, suddenly said, when it came to Petr Pavel, to this new president, they suddenly would say, shut up, it's not important anymore. And so it's actually not important anymore. They were right in this.
Both you and I have some experience from Poland. Can you imagine that in Poland, a politician like Andrej Babiš, who was born not in Poland, who has got some problems expressing himself in Polish, that he could become such a prominent personality in politics in Poland, for example?
Probably not, also not in Slovakia, where Babiš comes from. So these countries are, I would say, more nationally minded than Czechs. The Czechs are nationally rather indifferent, I would say. I don't know if you agree. But also the head of this SPD party, who is halfway Japanese, Korean origin.
I was just going to ask you about Tomio Okamura. I mean, when you imagine a guy like this, name, becoming a kind of nationalist against immigration politician.
Yeah, and even people who share his view on the mass migration, who are critical of mass migration, actually don't mind that this guy has a Asian face, so to speak. Speaking of Babiš and of the Slovaks, in the beginning of this ANO party of Babiš's career in politics, he had like other 2 or 3 people from Slovakia who by then lived in Prague for a very long time. Maybe even like 3 or 5 people from Slovakia with whom he would put in some very important positions. Like the mayor of Prague was also Slovak by origin with some accent in her Czech language. And no one would care actually. And this lady, for example, would even say that like the people in Prague are so arrogant. So imagine if you had a mayor of Warsaw who would be from Ukraine, for example, speaking Polish with some Ukrainian accent, and would start instructing the Warsawians on how the public transport in Kiev is much better organized than in Warsaw. They would probably get rid of him very, very quickly. But not so in the Czech Republic. So as I said, the Czechs don't care that much about ethnicity or about your national origin, I would say. Which I think per se is quite a good thing.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I actually have met a similar kind of position, similar opinions as you just expressed, that it shows the Czech kind of, if we think in more positively, the Czech tolerance or the Czech indifference, if we are not so positive about it, about where the
indifference is probably a better word.
It's probably more close to reality, isn't it? I mean, indifference. The last 2 questions, actually, that I have for you. My reading is that the Communist Party, which, 23 years ago, in 2022, the Communist Party got nearly 20% of the vote, 1/5 of the vote. Now it's failed to get to the parliament. I mean, what is left of the Communist Party? Obviously, the Communist Party, it needs to be said, literally died out. When you look at the membership numbers, I mean, the people just, passed away largely. But my reading also is that a lot of people who would have voted for a program like a Communist Party had, probably started voting for Andrej Babiš and his ANO party, probably for SPD, the Freedom and Direct Democracy Party, perhaps for the motorists as well. Would you agree with that reading?
I wouldn't agree with the part on motorists.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is almost no overlap between the Communist Party and Motorist Party, like in terms of voters. Otherwise, you are right, I think. So the main or the big chunk of the potential communist voters was won over by Andrej Babiš. He actually Babiš boasts of like killing the communists by stealing their voters. Some were probably also taken by Tomio Okamura. It's also true because Tomio Okamura is very much sovereignty-minded at one hand. At the other hand, his economic policies are confused. Some might pick up some left-wing politicians in the SPD party, and which would be interesting to the communist voters. And some politicians are actually libertarian, but that's how it is today. So yes, I would say the communists were like really stolen by the 2 of the 3 future governing parties. You were quite right when you said that the communist voters are dying out. It's quite obvious. And when the head of this formation, which was above the Communist Party in this election, because the Communist Party didn't run by itself, so they had quite they had kind of a new formation above them, and had all this formation started musing about the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia 1968, this August, and he said it actually. It was not what we think of what occupation looks like. It was much more, much milder and not so bad. And it was suddenly obvious that it was too far for very many potential voters of this formation. So, as I said, not only that the anti-communism has been dying out because the people are indifferent to the past of Andrej Babiš and at the same time to the past of the president Petr Pavel, but also the communism is dying out.
Finally, when you look at Czech politics today, and I suppose this doesn't apply only to Czech politics, but we are talking about Czechia and this is Czechast. Does it even make sense to speak about traditional left-wing and right-wing parties anymore, or have these kind of old ideological labels, conservative, liberal, socialist, have they lost much of their meaning today?
That's a good question. I think they lost some meaning, but not all. We have countries in Europe that are much more advanced in this losing of older meanings than the Czech Republic. And I actually think those labels could become some more meaning again, should be possible. I think the crucial thing will be how the outgoing governing parties, like the future opposition parties, how they will behave. So whether they cool down on this, in my view, quite impossible rhetoric language of democracy against Eastern barbarians or democracy against dictatorship. If they give it up, or at least a part of the opposition, if they give it up, this rhetoric, I think then realignment is possible. Some of those parties that now call themselves, we are the democratic parties, meaning they are not the Democrats. Some of those parties would position themselves again to be like, we are more conservative, we are more liberal, we are even like progressive, green. So I think, yes, it's possible. It's quite possible that it will become again like better defined, where the Czech politics might become better defined again.
You know, I did say finally, but let me just mention this to put my question into a context. Some 13 years ago, I was in the United States invited to Aspen, Colorado. There was a kind of seminar for journalists, and I was trying to explain, when I was asked, what the conservatives in Central Europe stand for, and to explain that even the conservative parties in Central Europe wouldn't dare to talk about the kind of abolishing the system of health care, universal health care, compulsory insurance. That was like, how can you be a conservative and not to refuse that? Was some of the questions that would be raised. And since the audience of Czechast is kind of international, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that even probably parties that we would call conservative wouldn't dare to say anything against or for having a private healthcare.
Correct. Yes. It's just that the economics is not. So your point was 100% right. It's just that the economics isn't so important anymore. I think for the definition of conservatives in Central Europe, more important is being against the woke wave coming from the West, like in culture matters, and even more important, being against this constant interference by the European Union. So this Green Deal policies, in my view, define the present much more than having this level of taxation or this health system. So Green Deal is the defining issue of the day, not the taxes.
Dan, thanks very much for your time. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you.
and I hope to speak to you soon again.
And that's all for this episode of Czechast. If you enjoyed our conversation, please consider following or liking the podcast or recommending Czechast to your friends. It really helps us spread the word and keep bringing you more stories from Czechia. And while you are at it, you might also want to check out our sister podcast, Prague Off the Beaten Track, where I explore the hidden corners and surprising histories of the Czech capital. Thank you for listening. I'm Vít Pohanka. Keep safe, keep healthy, and until next time, stay curious. Naslyšenou.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.